I was asked to talk about IVF tonight, and I realized that for some of you, from a medical standpoint, that might be shayach. For some of you, from a medical standpoint, it might not be shayach. Even if it's not shayach for you from a medical standpoint, it's worthwhile to listen and to understand this is really one aspect of the neflos habore, which we are privileged to work with and which we are privileged to help people with. And I think even if you don't need to know this for your own personal reasons, it's probably important to give you a sensitivity to understand the level of hishtadlus that some couples do have to go through, that some families will have to go through, and to really understand the nature of that hishtadlus and really the pilei playim that are involved day to day in this kind of technology. The field of reproductive biology in general has advanced enormously over the last 30 or so years, and by now, in the year Tafshin Ayin, where we are right now, many families who are suffering from fertility problems can really be helped very successfully with the various techniques of assisted reproduction. There are many frum families who are making use of the most sophisticated medical techniques of assisted reproduction. For example, IVF, which again is what I was asked to speak about tonight. I was asked to talk about IVF from a strictly medical standpoint, and to give an overview of what IVF is, when it is used, and how it can be used to help couples conceive. And after I finish speaking tonight, I'll be happy to entertain any questions that people may have, either publicly or privately. That's fine, and if anybody wants to give me a call at the office to make it even more private afterwards, you're always welcome to do that also. So I'd like to start off by reviewing a little bit about the history of IVF, which is actually quite interesting and quite amazing. And I'd like to talk about a little bit how the medical science has gotten to the point where we can really help people in this way by doing IVF for them. Although reproductive medicine is one of the newest and the youngest of all of the medical fields, and the modern history of IVF is a relatively short one, the study of embryology has fascinated scientists and philosophers for a very, very long time, and this also is really part of the fascination of IVF. Many years ago, scientists and philosophers divided really into two camps of theory, two types of thought about embryology. There was a famous scientist and philosopher whose name was Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, and later another person called Galen about 1,800 years ago. They felt that a husband and a wife each contribute seed to the developing baby, to the developing fetus, and that the seed of each parent contributes different structures to the fetus. They felt that the male seed gives rise to certain structures in the baby, and the female seed gives rise to other structures. Another philosopher named Aristotle, who lived about 2,500 years ago, he generally believed that every object in the world has both what he called a substance as well as a form. The substance is the actual object, the part that you can see and touch, and the form is a kind of a ghostly representation of the object that lies underneath its substance. And he extended this general theory to the area of embryology also. He believed that one parent gives rise to the substance of the fetus, and the other parent gives the form of the fetus. He felt that the parents do not have any kind of seed. He disagreed with that idea. He didn't think that the parents have some sort of seed which gives rise to the baby, to the pregnancy. Instead, he believed that only the male, only the husband, has seed, and this seed gives rise to the form of the baby. The female, he thought, does not have seed, but instead contributes her blood, which actually gives rise to the substance, the material from which the baby develops. That was his theory. It was not really until much later that Aristotle was proved to be completely wrong. Dr. William Harvey was a doctor who lived in the 1600s in the secular calendar, and he was probably best known for discovering the circulatory system, the idea of blood flowing through blood vessels into various parts of the body. But he also, much less known, but he also had a great interest in the area of reproduction. 350 years ago, he came up with a theory that people develop from eggs. That was his theory. He was mechadesh that in the world of medicine. And he felt that other mammals, together with people, will reproduce through fertilization, through the joining of an egg and a sperm. And although nobody at that point was actually able to identify a human egg or an egg of really any mammal until many years later, Dr. Harvey's theory was so strong and so well thought out that really in the scientific world, everybody assumed that he was right even before the discovery of the egg was finally made. "20 years after Dr. Harvey, there was a doctor whose name was Dr. Rainier de Graaff, and he continued the research that Dr. Harvey had started, and he described the egg follicle, which we'll talk more about later, but the egg follicle is a sac of fluid, as we now know, that has an egg inside of it. And he described the egg follicle, and to this day we actually call, you may have read about this, it's called a Graafian follicle because of Dr. de Graaff. But still, nobody had really yet been able to identify the actual human egg. Dr. Harvey had tried to look for the eggs of a deer inside the uterus of the deer, but he was not successful in that. He never found it. Others, after Dr. Harvey, have mistaken ovarian follicles for eggs. They saw these follicles in the ovaries, they thought those were the eggs, and that was not the case. It was not really until about 175 years ago that the human egg was definitively identified. It was Dr. Carl Ernst von Baer, who was a very well-known embryologist, who found the first egg of a mammal in a dog. He was studying this dog, he sacrificed the dog for his research, he found eggs inside of this dog. And in the year 1826, in a secular calendar, he was the first scientist to actually identify, be able to see the human egg. And Dr. von Baer published his discovery in a booklet, which he called On the Mammalian Egg and the Origin of Man. And he concluded, and this was a tremendous chiddush for the scientific world, that every animal which springs from the coition, the combining of male and female, is developed from an ovum, from an egg, and none from a simple formative liquid, which was what some of the philosophers earlier had believed. And this, again, was a scientific conclusion of tremendous, tremendous importance. Getting a little bit closer to more modern times. In 1878, a doctor named Dr. Schenk in Vienna actually tried to do IVF on mammalian eggs, but unfortunately it didn't work. 20 years after that, towards the end of the 1800s, Dr. Walter Heap collected early rabbit embryos that had been fertilized inside of the bodies of the rabbits, and he showed that these embryos could be actually transferred into the uterus of a rabbit and develop into a pregnancy. In 1936, now again getting closer to modern times, Dr. Gregory Pincus, he published his famous work which was called The Eggs of Mammals. And in his work, he described his success at working with eggs. He took eggs from their follicles, from the ovaries, and grew them successfully in the laboratory. A decade later, 10 years later, in 1946, there was a researcher in Boston at Harvard University named Dr. John Rock, also very well known, and he and his team reported one of the biggest breakthroughs in fertility medicine to that point. His team in Boston fertilized 4 human eggs in a petri dish in the laboratory. And while these early embryos were never transferred into anybody's uterus and never actually became a pregnancy, this really was the first human IVF in the laboratory in history. In 1959, move further along, in 1959, Dr. Chang, a person named MC Chang, successfully fertilized rabbit eggs in the laboratory, and he actually achieved the first successful rabbit IVF pregnancy and delivery. This was successful, and about 10 years after that, in 1969, a scientist in England whose name was Dr. Robert Edwards, working together with a gynecologic surgeon in England also named Dr. Patrick Steptoe, worked together to continue Dr. John Rock's success from Boston some years before at fertilizing human eggs. And this same group started to replace human embryos into the embryo's mothers in 1971. This is not so long ago now. It took about 5 years of disappointment for these researchers, for Dr. Edwards and Dr. Steptoe, and 5 years, long years of heartache and hope for the patients that they were trying to work with, before they managed to actually achieve the first successful IVF pregnancy, and this was in 1976. Unfortunately, tragically for the patients at the time, this pregnancy turned out to be an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy growing in the fallopian tube. And it actually had to be removed surgically in order to save the mother's life at that point. And then on July 25th, 1978, and this is now 31 and a half years ago, the first IVF baby in the world was born. Her name is Louise Brown. She's 31 years old now. She was born in England by a cesarean section. The operating room in England, where she was born at the time of the C-section, was packed. It was crowded with all kinds of people who were waiting to see what would come out, what the baby would look like, and whether there would be, God forbid, any birth defects, or just waiting out of curiosity to see what would be. And Baruch Hashem, by the way, Louise Brown is a healthy young person now. Her sister was also born through IVF. And her sister actually just recently, about a year ago or so, had a child. So this was probably actually the first IVF grandchild in the world. Meanwhile, moving to a different area, more important to us. The graphics are not coming out. I'm so sorry. I'll have to read you the Hebrew. Nothing we can do about that, Avi, I guess. No? All right, not a problem. Chazal, our Chazal, also actually had a lot to say about embryology, and I'll read you the Gemara Nida, which won't make sense here. Tanu Rabbanan, Shlosha Shutfin Yesh Ba'adam, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ve'aviv Ve'imo. Aviv Mazriya Haloven, Shemimenu Atzamos Ve'gidin V'tziparnayim, Umoach Shebarosho Ve'loven Sheba'ayin. The Gemara said that there are three Shutfin, three partners in the creation of a person. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, father and the mother, this is famous. The father's seed, the father's zera, the Gemara says, supplies the white substance from which are derived bones, blood vessels, nails, brain, and the white part of the eye. The Gemara continues, Imo mazra'as odem, shemimenu ar uvasar usa'aros v'shachar sheba'ayin. V'akadosh Baruch Hu nosein bo ruach u'neshama u'plester panim u're'iyas ha'ayin Ushmias ha'ozen v'dibor peh v'haloch raglayim uvina v'haskel. Says the Gemara, the mother's seed provides the red substance, which is where we get the flesh and the muscle and the black part of the eye. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives the spirit and the neshama beauty, sight, hearing, speech, mobility, and bina v'haskel, wisdom and understanding. Clearly, v'cheven shehigia zmano lihipater min ha'olam, continues the Gemara, HaKadosh Baruch Hu notel chelko, v'chelek aviv v'imo meiniach lifneihem. That the Gemara realizes, clearly from this you can see, that there is the existence of a female seed. Chazal are telling us already, many, many years ago, before even any of the Greek philosophers, this was already known in Torah. The Torah itself in Sefer Vayikra says, Isha ki Tazria v'yolda zachar, a famous pasuk at the beginning of Tazria. The Gemara, the Chumash is talking about this pasuk when it's introducing the halachos of Tuma and Tara that have to do with childbirth. The literal translation of this pasuk is actually an embryologic translation. When a woman gives forth seed, when a woman emits seed, Isha ki Tazria, and gives birth to a male, this suggests that indeed a woman does contribute seed. Now, most of the Mefarshim actually translate this pasuk in a less literal way to mean when a woman conceives, not necessarily gives forth seed. And according to that, the Torah is not necessarily addressing the particular embryology issue. It just means, in a more general way. But that's not true for all the Mefarshim. Actually, the Ramban, this is the Ramban, actually interprets the pasuk literally. The Ramban says, and I'll read it again to you, Isha ki Tazria, Isha mazra'as tchila yoledes zachar. Mazra'as al dam harechem sheyis asef b'shas gmar bia be'em umis achez b'zera hazachar ki l'da'atam havlad notzar midam hanekeva umiloven ha'ish v'lishneihem yikru zera. That's what the Ramban says. The Gemara Nida, says the Ramban, states that from the words Isha ki Tazria v'yolda zachar, we learn that a male child will be born if the woman is mazriya first before her husband. And this hazra'ah of the female, says the Ramban, refers to the odem, the red substance that we already saw that the Gemara says is the female contribution, is the wife's contribution to the embryo's development. Both the male white substance and the female red substance, says the Ramban, are seed. And the pasuk really does mean Isha ki sazriya, if a woman gives off seed. The Ramban continues. Ramban was a doctor, and he continues to point out that what he is expressing was actually believed among the medieval physicians at his time. He says, "V'gam da'as harofim bayitzira kachi." He says that that's exactly what the physicians believe about conception, about pregnancy. And this, the Ramban further says, it goes against the thinking of the Greek philosophers. He says, "V'aldas philosophe hayevanim kol guf ha'ubar midam ha'isha ein bo la'isha lahakoach shehu nosein tzura b'chomer." The Ramban rejects the thinking of Aristotle that we saw before, who we saw believes that one parent gives rise to the substance of the fetus and the other gives rise to its form. The Ramban believes that there is seed from the male and seed from the female, and these seeds give rise to the fetus, which again is what we know scientifically now. Everybody knows that to be true. And interestingly, this is actually a pretty interesting reference by one of the Ramban's Talmidim, the Rashba, to the fact that the Ramban actually included fertility treatment in his medical practice. And in a tshuva, the Rashba was asked, I'll read it to you, Rofe Yisrael, Mahu la'asos refua la'nochris, Kadesha tisaber olo. Va'ani ra'isi as harav Rabbeinu Moshe bar Nachman zal shenisasek b'malacha zu etzel hanochris b'schar. The Rashba was asked whether it's permissible, whether it's mutter for a Jewish doctor to treat a non-Jewish couple, a non-Jewish woman, let's say, for infertility. And the Rashba says that he saw the Ramban allows it. He saw his teacher, the Ramban, doing exactly that, treating couples for fertility. The Rambam, also, of course, a doctor. The Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah, and again I'll read it to you, Ulamala min ha'cheder u'min ha'prozdar, bein cheder la'prozdar, hu ha'makom sheyesh bo shtei beitzim shel isha, v'hashvilim shebohem isbasheles shechva zera shela. So what exactly the cheder and the prozdar are, then, which is also mentioned in the Mishnah Nida, is a matter of debate. But according to the Rambam, the female's ovaries, he says, produce seed that ripens. And he in fact refers to this female seed as shechva zera, which is often the same phrase which we use to describe a husband's seed. Now science, of course, by now has fully supported this view in Chazal and Rishonim that human pregnancy comes about by combining a male and female seed, and this is exactly what allows us to do IVF. And just to show you, this is unbelievable. I'm sorry you can't see it up here. I'll read it to you again, but this is something absolutely fascinating, which really shows us the tremendous insight and really the Das Torah of our Rishonim. Specifically, this is a Meiri in Sanhedrin who basically predicts IVF. Listen to this. Kol shehu na'aseh b'f'ula tivis, eino bechlal kishufim. Afilu yad'u livro brios yafos shelo mizivug hamin, rishayim lasos, shekol shehu tivi, eino bechlal kishuf. V'doma lezeh amru kol sheyesh bo mishum refuah, ein bo mishum darchei ho'amori. He says that anything which is done through the process of nature is not forbidden, is not usher under the isser of kishuf, of participating in magic. And even if, the Meiri says, we were to someday learn how to create a human being without natural relations between a husband and a wife, even that would be mutter, he says, because that would be considered within the realm of nature. That would be in the general b'derech hateva and not within the realm of magic. And this is absolutely amazing Ruach HaKodesh. This is unbelievable to me. To understand now what IVF is all about, we'll move into the medical aspects now, we really have to first review the basic processes of human reproduction, the basic reproductive processes. Every doctor and scientist who is involved with clinical IVF, working with embryos and eggs and sperm in the laboratory, gets an opportunity to appreciate the complexity and really the nes nigla of the reproductive process. Our biologic blueprints, as we all know, consist of genes, of DNA, which is grouped into 46 chromosomes. These 46 chromosomes have all the instructions that throughout our lives tell all of the different parts of our bodies what to do and how to function, day to day, minute to minute. In order to form a new human being, we have to create a new 46 chromosome blueprint. We have to create a new blueprint to tell a new human being's body and cells exactly what to do. And this happens by the merging or the combination of 23 chromosomes from the mother and 23 chromosomes from the father. Every tiny cell in all of our bodies contains this entire blueprint of 46 chromosomes, except there is one type of cell, special cell in the body, which contains only a half number of chromosomes, which has only 23 chromosomes for the purposes of reproduction. And these special cells are called gametes. That's the general term, it's called a gamete. When a male gamete, which has only 23 chromosomes, merges with a female gamete, that is called fertilization. The 23 chromosomes from the husband and the 23 chromosomes from the wife combine together to form an embryo, which is a new potential person, which has the 46 chromosome blueprint that any person needs in order to live. And these gametes, as we all probably know, have names. The male gamete scientifically is called the spermatozoon, or the sperm, what we refer to as the male zera, and it's produced in the testis, in the beitzim. The female gamete is the oocyte, or the ovum, or the egg, and the female gamete, the egg, lives in a woman's ovaries. Sperm cells are small, very small, and motile, which means that they can swim, and that's critically important. Sperm cells have a head, which you can see right at the top over there, which is what contains the 23 chromosomes. They're all packed inside of that little oval-shaped head. Sperm cells also have a long, thin tail, which moves the cell along and allows it to swim. And it has a neck. The neck is right there underneath the head, which is full of structures that have energy. It's called mitochondria. They're special structures that are like the engine that drives the tail to allow the sperm to swim and to swim fast. The female egg does not swim. So in the natural reproductive process, it's the job of the sperm to find its way to the egg, not the other way around. Fertilization is when the sperm swims to the egg and attaches to the egg and enters the egg, and the 23 chromosomes in the sperm combine with the 23 chromosomes in the egg. In order for fertilization to happen naturally, many things have to work right and work well for both the husband and for the wife. From the husband's point of view, sperm have to be produced normally and then deposited successfully, the shasmaisa, in the vaginal area right there. This is the upper portion of the vaginal area, and that's where the zera have to get to. They then have to swim through the female reproductive tract, including the cervix, which is the entryway into the uterus. And the cervix produces mucus that can either help the sperm swim through, or it can actually be hostile and kill off the sperm. The sperm then have to swim through the cavity of the uterus, where that arrow is going, all the way up through the uterus, which is a distance, an enormous distance to a single sperm. It's a distance that's 1,000 times the length of a single sperm. It's a very, very long journey. And then they have to swim through the fallopian tube. That's the tube. And there, near the end of the fallopian tube, where that arrow is leading, the successful sperm will actually meet and fertilize the egg. And that's the egg sitting right there at the end of the fallopian tube. These over here are the ovaries. That's where the woman's eggs developed many years before, when she herself was a fetus, a baby inside of her mother's uterus. The eggs sat quietly for all these years, waiting for the reproductive years to come along, and that's when the eggs become active. Now, a woman, the wife, prepares extensively every month for this potential meeting of gametes. And it's a complex and exquisitely coordinated process every month. Over the course of the menstrual cycle, an area in the brain, which is called the hypothalamus in the brain, produces a hormone which is called gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. And this hormone causes the pituitary gland, which is also at the bottom of the brain, to produce certain hormones. It produces a hormone specifically called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and you can actually see FSH is this yellow line over here. That's the production of FSH. And what FSH does is it tells the ovary to prepare a follicle. As we're producing FSH, the ovary is getting a follicle ready. You can see the ovaries function up at the top. And again, we said that the follicle is a fluid-filled sac which has an egg inside of it, which has to ovulate, which has to be released from the ovary. The developing follicle produces estrogen. This is called estradiol, which is one type of estrogen, which is produced by the ovary. And the estrogen, meanwhile, causes the inside of the uterus, the lining of the uterus right here, to thicken up, to become thicker after having been shed and thinned out during the previous period. Once the follicle reaches a mature size of approximately an inch in size, you can actually see it very clearly, and we'll see some pictures of it later. Increasing estrogen levels at that point tell a gland in the brain